This video is a webinar by the Wisconsin Green Fire Organization. Wisconsin Green Fire supports Wisconsin's conservation legacy by promoting science-based management of Wisconsin natural resources. This series is brought to you by FWSP Explorers. It is being shown with permission from Wisconsin Green Fire. FWSP Explorers would like to thank Michael McFadden for getting the permission to show this video. The four-part series features a trio of expert panelists talking about wolf management in Wisconsin. The history of wolves and wolf management in Wisconsin features an inclusive and transparent process that is essential to effective wolf management. What public perceptions of wolves can tell us about coexistence and how our neighbor Minnesota is managing its resident wolf population. Panelists are Adrian from WGF Wildlife, he's the co-chair there, Jody from the Midwest Environmental Advocates, and Peter from the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife.
Good morning and welcome to our conservation webinar, Opportunities for Collaboration, a Shared Vision for Wolves in Wisconsin, hosted by Wisconsin's Green Fire. My name is Sarah Wilkins and I'm Science Director for Wisconsin's Green Fire. We're joined today by our Executive Director, Fred Clark, who will be helping the webinar run smoothly. I'm going to pass the controls over to Fred Clark, who has been moderating and tracking the questions that have been coming in, and he'll take it from there.
Great, thank you, Sarah, and thank you to Jody and Peter and Adrian for wonderful and informative presentations. We've asked the three of our panelists to provide their own unique points of view based on their experience, and I think they have all done that today in a really effective way. So we've got a large number of questions. We certainly won't get through all of, but many of you submitted questions ahead of the program today when you registered, and thank you for those of you who took time to do that. And we've also got a large number of questions in the queue. So without further ado, we're going to invite any of our panelists to respond to the questions as they see fit. Number one is, I think, Adrian, maybe this will go to you first. Back to some of your earlier points about how we monitor and estimate the wolf population. Is the population estimate derived from a model at all, or is it solely based on the winter survey and the pup surveys that you described? And in your estimate, based on the methods that we're using, how accurate or how variable can we expect those population estimates to be from year to year?
Yeah, well, currently it's based on minimum counts and based on track observations in the wintertime, radio collar packs that are observed from the air, public observations that can be verified, but it represents a minimum count of the wolf population, which is probably very suitable when you have very few wolves in the landscape, as the population increases in numbers, it becomes more challenging. And there are current efforts underway to do a patch occupancy modeling system. And that has been done experimentally in Wisconsin the last 3-4 years. We don't have a population count for 2020 yet, either a minimum count or patch occupancy modeling count, but that is the plan for Wisconsin DNR. The benefits of this other method is that it will give you some kind of a confidence interval. That one of the problems with minimum counts is they don't allow you to estimate confidence intervals. But I'm guessing the confidence intervals will be fairly broad. The experimental use of patch occupancy modeling the last couple of years has shown that generally when that estimate is made, the minimum count ends up being near the lower end of a normal 95% confidence interval. So that's kind of what you expect a minimum count to do, that it gives you a bare minimum number of the animals that can be detected, verified in the field, recognizing you're always going to miss a few animals. And the estimation process that will use modeling that will be used in the future will give you a broader confidence interval. Plans will be to continue to do minimum counts and a mixture of minimum counts and population estimations in the future.
Thank you. Peter or Jody, any other comments on that question?
I might comment briefly. I would just say we use this term minimum count. This is close to a census effort. And it's interesting to me that this method has gotten attacked sometimes, because really in a lot of ways, the Wisconsin approach to counting wolves has kind of been considered the gold standard. It is interesting to note that the 3 states in the Midwest all use little different methods in coming up with their estimated wolf population. But it's always been interesting to me too that all 3 of those numbers that they generate make a lot of sense relative to each other. And they suggest that really kind of provides credence to each of the numbers that's being conducted. And I would just say this move towards occupancy modeling isn't really so much an effort to get a better count as to find really a more reasonable or more affordable way to try to come up with an adequate count. Because the census methodology gets expensive as the wolf population grows. But there will probably be wide confidence intervals around it, and that's something that people are going to have to take into account when they're thinking about population management.
Well, thank you. I think the next question follows on this, and that's, can you talk more about what the population management goal, what that number should mean for us? Does it represent a minimum population? Does it represent a maximum? How should, if that number is used in a management plan, how does that inform the work of the department and the work of tribes and others in defining a wolf management program?
Yeah, the 350 management goal that grew out of the 1999 plan was intended to be a goal to try a number to achieve and maintain a population near that level. But it was never intended to be a cap or a ceiling on the wolf population, that we're going to hold the wolf population at this number. And it was intended to be a temporary number that was going to be reviewed every 5 to 10 years to see whether the number was still suitable based on the best available science. The number 350 was somewhat of a political compromise that, as Peter had mentioned, the Wolf Committee itself had recommended managing for a population between 300 to 500 wolves. And that through various efforts was reduced to a 350 management goal. And that was what was finalized in the final plan. But it's a level that was based on assumptions that carrying capacity was about 500 wolves for Wisconsin in the 1990s. And more recent estimates suggest the carrying capacity for the state may be well over 1,200. So the goal was based on the best available science at the time in 1990s, as well as some political compromises.
The one thing I would add too is this idea of a science-based assessment really is the most productive path forward, rather than trying to gear it towards either game management interests or otherwise. And as Adrian just mentioned, it's so much based on the science, peer-reviewed science for carrying capacity, even as what's been demonstrated in recent years, and of course the social science data. So we do have this public attitude survey from August of 2014, and it is available on the DNR's website. But that's already 6 years ago. And as we are seeing in our country, attitudes change and ideas are flourishing at, it seems like a accelerated rate. And I would imagine that also pertains to wildlife management concerns. So we do need to have a better understanding of the public's tolerance within wolf range for populations of wolves in coexistence, and also to understand the science. And maybe Peter, you can speak to this, given what you shared about the views of the tribes regarding wolves self-regulating their populations, is the science of that wolves will, if left alone, manage and reach a plateau of their population themselves, and that hunting oftentimes disrupts the natural pack order, their ability to be productive and to maintain that population level. So that could be an interesting entry into the science of wolves self-regulating abilities in that regard.
Yeah, and I think there was a comment or two, maybe in the comments box, but I would just reiterate, this thought that 350 number was a compromise. It was created at a time when we only had about 200 wolves in the state. And again, as Adrian mentioned, we thought carrying capacity was maybe in the ballpark of 500. And what we know now, what we've learned in the last 20 years, teaches us that number is considerably poorer as a goal than we thought. We also do know that wolves are really good at regulating themselves and at very low numbers. Their numbers have plateaued in Minnesota. It looks like they're plateauing here in Wisconsin and in Michigan as well. And interesting that in both of those two states, and I think in parts of Wisconsin, when we look at other species, this whole kind of heavy emphasis on numbers is being moved away from. The other two states do not have a target population. That's not what 350 was in Wisconsin anyway, even though it's been interpreted that way. But there's sort of more specific goals that are developed. So if your goal, for example, is to have an effective depredation program, then your goal is to meet those goals and not a specific number of wolves. And so as long as you have an effective program in place, then maybe it doesn't matter whether you have 500 wolves or 700 wolves. So you set up these other thresholds and criteria to meet that take you away from this focus on numerics.
Great, thank you. Really thoughtful responses. A question was raised about chronic wasting disease. And as we continue to see the spread of chronic wasting disease into wolf territories, do we have any understanding or prediction about the role that wolves may play in either limiting or affecting the spread of CWD?
Well, the evidence on wolf impact and chronic wasting disease probably are three different areas. One is that there was some modeling done about 9-10 years ago that suggested, based on the kind of behaviors wolves display, that they could potentially impact the spread, reduce the spread of a disease such as chronic wasting disease, and perhaps even prevent it from establishing. A second line of evidence, our cougar research in Colorado shows that cougars are 3 to 5 times as likely to kill deer that have chronic wasting disease than the average hunter. And cougars are ambush predators. Unlike coursing predators, there's actually less of a testing process, so they're probably less selective even than wolves would be. A third line of evidence are that where we have healthy wolf packs across Wisconsin, we have almost no evidence of chronic wasting disease establishing in the wild. So while we've not been able to test wolves in areas of chronic wasting disease, in part because it doesn't seem to happen there, the evidence seems to suggest that it's unlikely that it will establish in those areas, but we shouldn't take it for granted that it never will occur there, and we still need to be careful and to carefully monitor for chronic wasting disease throughout the state, so that it can be dealt with specifically if it does occur. But there's evidence that wolves may be an important factor.
And I would just emphasize Adrian's comment about, healthy wolf packs. We need more research in this realm, but I think there's some reason to think that wolves are sort of the white blood cells out there, helping to maintain the health of the deer herd. And to that degree, the number of them you have is important. Wisconsin is going to be more protected against chronic wasting disease with a higher population of wolves than with a lower one. It's pretty simple math, I think, at that point.
And this just complements what was just said, but when a DNR or wildlife team is very beholden to specific numbers, that really does drive, again, if there were to be harvest again, the amount. At the end of the last harvest, there was in 2014, they were looking at the wolf pack number, the average was 2.5 wolves. And it would be up to the scientists to be able to argue whether or not an average size of 2.5 wolves is a functioning body that can protect that wolf pack from not having to go to depredation. Are they still able to hunt deer and other natural prey? So it's the human disruption that often appears to be more of a problem or a challenge when we're talking about chronic wasting disease, of course, perhaps wolf mortality, and again, re-emphasizing forest health. Wolves, just by the scientists tell us, they keep the deer moving. They keep them not just in one part of forest and allow for a healthier, more diverse forest system. So there's a lot of interesting videos and readings on that positive aspect of wolves as well on the landscape.
Thank you. Peter, you touched on the issue of wolf depredation a bit in your talk, but I think as a couple of questioners have pointed out, is the wolf population has reached a higher level than we've seen in the past. The extent of wolf-human interactions, the extent of wolf depredations of dogs and of livestock have increased. What, in your opinion, for any of you, needs to be in place in order to manage those conflicts and help minimize the sort of social lack of acceptance for wolves on the landscape?
So I'll take a stab at starting this discussion off. I'd say, first of all, that livestock depredations are a problem for individual livestock growers. They're not much of a problem for the livestock industry as a whole. The number of livestock that are verified killed or injured by wolves in Wisconsin in a year is comparable to the number that go to slaughter about every 30 minutes, 365 days of the year. So yet, if you're an individual losing 1 or 2 or 3 calves, that's significant to you. You know, hunting is often brought up as a tool to maybe help address this. The fact is that that's a very ineffective tool. If I'm losing a calf in the spring, hunting season in the fall, that may or may not have any impact on the wolves that are causing me problems, just isn't a very effective technique. So what you need is really, Wisconsin has got a strong program in place. When people have a suspected depredation, preserve the evidence, get the federal agents there quickly to make a confirmation of what the actual cause of the loss is, and then undertake appropriate steps quickly to address that problem when and where it's occurring. And those are the kinds of things that can be effective.
Sarah, I don't know if you could pull up, there was a slide I had of the numbers of farms and the depredations by year. If you can pull that up.
Yeah, just give me 1 second.
Yep, so I'll start talking while you're doing that. But the point I'd like to make is that there's often an assumption made that the levels of depredation correspond exactly with the population, that as the population goes up, the depredation goes up, population goes down, the depredation goes down. What I want to demonstrate here is that if you look at this, the numbers of farms with wolf depredations, it peaks in 2010, while our wolf population was still growing through 2012. So, and then between 2010, 2014, there's over 50% reduction in numbers of farms with depredations. But this is a time period wolves were actively being managed. There was an active depredation control program that allowed lethal controls on problem wolves by government trappers, as well as farmers. There was a hunting season in place as well. And we see a constant reduction of the numbers of farms with depredations, much more drastically than the reduction in the wolf population. The wolf population from the start of 2012, when they're delisted, was about 815. When they were relisted again, it was about 746. So an 8% reduction in the wolf population resulted in over 50% reduction in the numbers of farms with depredation, suggesting that a more flexible management did allow for drastic reductions, showing that you can reduce levels of depredation without having to drastically reduce the numbers of wolves on the landscape.
Great, thanks, Adrian.
And one thing I would add, Fred, is to this discussion point is, as Peter mentioned, the number of actual livestock that are killed is a very small percentage of livestock lost due to fire or illness or cold, other type matters. There have been certain studies that have suggested 1% are attributable to all predator kills, which would include coyote and bear and wolves. So it's a small amount. Something that reveals that, which is interesting, is what just came out for the state of Michigan just last week relating to the Upper Peninsula, where there are 900 livestock operations. Only 6 out of them, according to the Michigan records that from their government, their version of our DNR and DATCAP, only 6 of the approximately 900 operations, or 0.006%, experienced a conflict with wolves in 2019. So it's very small numbers. What much of the science, and I'd be interested in hearing more on the science, has shown that beyond dealing with particular problem wolves, the animal husbandry techniques of the actual livestock operators, such as fencing, guard dogs, and flagging, and the like, or in combination, have proven far more effective necessarily than certainly a recreational hunting season, which, as Peter described, is many months later and might not even be involving the particular problem wolves or those who are not honoring the constraints of the fencing and the like. So it's just something more to think about.
Thank you, Jody. A couple of people have asked questions about the role of, you all have described the sort of stakeholder process and some of what has gone into our current wolf management system and presumably what could go into a future system. What is the role of the Conservation Congress in informing the wolf management at the state level?
I'll jump in initially. So in Wisconsin, the Conservation Congress does have statutory role as advising the DNR on all wildlife management, fisheries management issues. And throughout our wolf planning process, we've always had seats on any advisory committee, that there was always a seat, 1 or 2 seats for members of the Conservation Congress. So they've played roles, they've helped facilitate meetings and hearings on wolf management. So yeah, they have been a part of the wolf management process from the beginning.
Okay, thank you. Another question directed to you, Jody. Peter mentioned the word that we don't often, laymen don't often hear, or lay people don't often hear, and that's usufructuary rights. Peter, can you or Jody speak just a bit more about what usufructuary rights are and whether those rights have been tested in court, or what particular rights are understood to be covered under that concept?
Peter, do you want to begin under the VOIT agreements? It was really under that agreement that defined those and how they have been used or tried to be used as it pertained to the wolf harvest for those 3 seasons. That is more controversial, but maybe you could lay the groundwork and I could add in from there.
Well, speaking as a non-lawyer, I'll say, I mean, my understanding is that it's sort of a elegant way of saying use right. And that being said, it's not necessarily very specifically defined by the courts. And there is some wiggle room, I think, in how you interpret what that means. There are those, I think, who would say that you only use things, for example, a wildlife species, maybe by harvesting it. The tribes, I think, would disagree with that statement very much. You might use a maple tree by cutting it down and converting it to firewood, but you might also use it for sap or to enjoy its shade. And when it comes to wolves, you might use them by taking advantage of the ecological benefits they provide, like helping keep the deer herd healthy. So that's the tribe's perspective, I think, and that they're using wolves even though they have no interest in harvesting their brother. But you could probably put a more elegant legal description on all of this, Jody.
No, I think that's really is the understanding. There was quite a bit of controversy and legal analysis of the usurpatory rights under Voigt agreement during the 3 mandated harvests in Wisconsin, and how the tribes really tried to convey that was that they would take their allotment under the agreement, but not use them for hunting purposes. As you stated, the use that they argued was that to keep them alive as living sentient beings, culture in alignment with their cultural beliefs and otherwise. And the game that was played then, of course, was for the next year and next 2 years, the harvest quotas were reconfigured with the foreknowledge that the tribes would not be actually using their rights under the treaty for hunting and trapping purposes. And that's really how it boiled out. I think it's still very much an issue open to legal interpretation or legal resolution. It is an interesting one and a good question.
Thanks. Well, in the few minutes that we have left, I want to ask each of you to just offer your thoughts about what you believe needs to happen going forward. So part of the reason that we're holding this program is because we understand it to be very likely that wolves will be delisted again sometime soon. And then there will be ball back in the court of the state of Wisconsin to determine how to manage the wolf population in context with our tribal partners and others. I want to ask each of the 3 of you to just take a minute and lay out what you think the most important elements of a robust, sustainable process are for developing a wolf management plan in Wisconsin. And Jody, if you'll let me, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think that much of my presentation really did lay out that roadmap. You heard my speaking to the importance of a science-based aspect, really science that is vetted, that is peer-reviewed, that allows that to move forward. Because as we all know, for other matters not related to wolves, not everyone trusts science or necessarily believes it applies to things that they have beliefs about. So to have the best available science available to our wolf management plan, that helps with respect to the public's buy-in and support for those recommendations. The second important pillar, of course, is this inclusive and representative broad array of interests or perspectives. And Peter even pointed to Minnesota's having folks who are not aligned or affiliated with any particular organization, that they are concerned Wisconsin citizens, end of story. And to have those perspectives, because again, what science is relied upon and prioritized will very much depend upon whether or not Wisconsin is interested in a management plan geared towards game management, stuck on this mandated harvest for wolves, which might not be supported by either science or public tolerance or acceptance as we move ahead, especially given what we all know of this mass extinction going on in the world, and concerns related to forests and habitat, biodiversity, and the like. Attitudes will change, and we need to allow for that flexibility in our planning. So with those two key components, I believe that Wisconsin can operate productively, even with the legal constraints that currently exist, which might, of course, change in the years to come as well. And then there'd be even more opportunity to go with the science and with public attitudes. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. Peter?
You know, everything Jody said, I think you'd see the tribes agree with. You know, the only real addition to that is that the tribes are not stakeholder groups, and it is critically important that the state really embrace in a positive way the government-to-government consultation that's required. Those are the big litmus tests that are out there. I think that really covers the primary things. If you have an open process, I will add just one little caveat about, you know, that again, while the tribes are not stakeholders, we do appreciate the opportunity to be involved and interact with those groups. It's beneficial for us to learn straight from them their concerns, and I hope it's beneficial to them to hear from the tribes. So having both tiers of this communication, I think, are an important thing going forward.
Thank you. And Adrian, I'm just going to ask if, in addition to your comments and your closing, a few people have asked about how citizens can be involved in the process going forward to inform a good process. And if you could also touch on that in your closing.
Sure. Yeah.
Wrap it up.
So I agree with an open, transparent process based on sound science. And once Wisconsin DNR will start that process, there will be public hearings, meetings, opportunities, I'm sure, through the internet to comment on wolf management efforts, the proposed plans being considered. Eventually, any wolf plan by the Wisconsin DNR will have to be presented to the Natural Resource Board. Those are public hearings. The public has opportunity to attend those meetings. And there will be legislative review of that plan, and those would be also be public opportunities for public input. So there's a lot of different ways people can get involved. I think one of the things we want to be recognized is we also need to celebrate the success of wolf recovery in Wisconsin. We're talking about 1,000 wolves in a state that has almost 6,000 people, or 6 million people, has 1.5 million cows, and yet we've been able to support and maintain a healthy wolf population, which when I was growing up as a kid in the 1960s, I thought there was never a possibility we were going to have anything more than a handful of wolves back in the state, if at all possible. We thought they're wilderness species that were no longer going to exist in Wisconsin. We're finding we've got healthy wolf populations. The big issues will be the goals, and the biggest part of goals will be where wolves can live and how many we can have there. And we've found that 85% of our wolf packs don't cause livestock depredation problems, don't attack pet dogs, that most of our packs live in forested areas where they're benefiting the ecosystem. So I think an open, transparent process and encourage people to get involved to whatever extent they want to.
Wonderful. Thank you, Adrian. This has been great, really informative, I think, for all of us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Perfect. Thanks, Fred. I'm just going to share my screen here to close us out today. We want to thank all of you for joining us. I know there are people calling in from all over the country, so thank you for being here and for listening in on our panel discussion. If you're interested in learning more and participating with Greenfire, how you can get involved, we urge you and suggest, recommend checking out our 2020 annual meeting, which is coming up in September.